After being humiliated in public, a talented designer decided it was time to show her cards. She did not succumb, but instead used her pain as a weapon to overthrow her husband's empire of lies. Hear this story of spectacular revenge and rebirth. You knew something was wrong the moment Grant chose the dress for you. It wasn't one of your own designs. The pieces you'd poured your sweat, tears, and soul into in your small studio. No, it was a jet black evening gown so safe it was boring from some high-end brand. "You need to look classic, Stella," he'd said, his tone like he was giving expert advice to a naive intern, not speaking to the woman who had won the Emerging Designer of the Year award just 6 months prior. "This is the hospital gala. People want to see a surgeon's wife, not an abstract art piece." Every word was a small, invisible cut. You were used to them. For the past 5 years, you'd learned to bandage those wounds with smiles and silence. You remembered the early days when he would proudly boast to his friends, "My wife is an artist. She sees the world in a way we can't." Back then, your career was an interesting accent piece in his perfect life. Now, as your brand began to gain recognition, as your name appeared in magazines, without his attached, it had become an inconvenience, an embarrassing truth to be hidden and downplayed. Tonight's charity gala was held at the city's most luxurious hotel. The air was thick with expensive perfume and self-important conversations. This was Grant's world, not yours. He moved through the crowd like a king in his domain, shaking hands with department heads, nodding at hospital board members. His smile as perfectly polished as a surgical instrument. You followed a half-step behind a well-rehearsed supporting role. "Stella, darling," Grant said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear his hand on the small of your back. Not as a gesture of affection, but of positioning. "This is Dr. Hayes, our head of anesthesiology, and his wife, Margaret. A pleasure to meet you both." You smiled a smile you'd practiced in the mirror 100 times. It was just warm enough to be polite, just distant enough not to invite prying questions. "Oh, Stella," Margaret said, her eyes scanning your dress. "You look so elegant." "Grant must have excellent taste." You just nodded. Even your appearance was no longer your own achievement. Every compliment was redirected to him as if you were a mannequin he'd dressed. You wanted to scream, "My best dress is in my studio. It's made of hand-painted silk organza, and it would take your breath away. But my husband wanted me to look like every other doctor's wife in this room." But you didn't. You just sipped your champagne and let the conversation wash over you. "Stella's in fashion," Grant interjected when Dr. Hayes asked what you did. He said the word fashion with a slight emphasis, as if it were a childish hobby like stamp collecting or pottery. Not, "She owns a rising fashion label," not, "She's an award-winning designer," but simply in fashion. Like you arranged racks at a department store. You felt the familiar heat of anger begin to smolder in your chest. It was a small flame you'd learned to extinguish 1,000 times. You told yourself this wasn't the place, that he was just stressed from work, that he didn't mean it. The lies you told yourself had become the dull soundtrack to your marriage. Then, as the orchestra began to play a slow, melodic tune, you made an impulsive decision. Maybe if you could just reconnect with him for a single moment, you could find the man who once loved your creations, who used to stay up all night just to watch you sketch. That memory, however, faded, propelled you forward. You found Grant with a group of other surgeons, their hands gesturing animatedly as they discussed some complex laparoscopic technique. You touched his arm gently. The conversation stopped. All eyes turned to you. Grant's face tightened. You knew you'd broken some unspoken rule. "Dance with me." You said, your voice smaller than you intended, more of a plea than an invitation. You saw him calculate. Refusing would make him look bad. Accepting would interrupt his important conversation. In the end, he chose the path of least resistance. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Duty calls. Duty. That's what you had become. If you find this story interesting, please comment. Number 1. If you find it not interesting enough, do not hesitate to like and leave your opinion in the comment section. Maybe you will make the next stories better. He led you to the dance floor, his hand on your waist feeling foreign, mechanical. You moved, but there was no harmony. It was more like two strangers trying to remember the steps than a married couple. The patient in 302 had a post-op complication. He said, his eyes scanning the room over your shoulder, tracking who was talking to whom. "I might have to go back to the hospital tonight." "That's a shame," you whispered, trying to pull him closer. His body resisted maintaining that careful distance. Impatience radiated from his every move. Around you, other couples swayed in easy intimacy. You saw an older doctor whisper something in his wife's ear that made her giggle. You saw a younger couple, hands intertwined, looking only at each other as if the world had disappeared. A sharp pain bloomed in your chest, an ache of both bitterness and envy. The champagne, the music, and the memory of better times created a dangerous moment of hope. Maybe if you could just bridge this gap, just remind him. You took a deep breath, lifted your head, and leaned in. It wasn't a passionate or dramatic kiss, just a simple one. The kind couples give each other at parties, when the music is soft and the lights are low. The kind that says, "We're still here. It's still us, still together." Grant recoiled violently. The revulsion on his face was unmistakable, as if you'd just tried to force-feed him poison. And then, loud enough for everyone around you to hear clear enough that the music couldn't hide it, he spoke the words that would be forever burned into your mind. "I'd rather kiss a corpse in the anatomy lab than kiss you." The laughter was immediate, cruel, and sharp as a razor. Dr. Hayes nearly spilled his drink. Margaret brought a hand to her mouth in delighted shock. The sound hit you in waves, each peal of laughter, its own distinct wound. But Grant wasn't finished. The laughter had emboldened him. He raised his voice, ensuring everyone could hear the encore. "You don't even meet my basic aesthetic standards. Get away from me." More laughter. Someone whistled. The room began to spin, not from the champagne, but from the raw, brutal truth that had just been dropped on you. All the signs you had willfully ignored now screamed in your face the nights he said he was on call. But his shirt smelled of a strange perfume. The increasingly harsh critiques of your work, the cold indifference that had replaced love. You had been trying to save something that was already long dead, and then, as the laughter still echoed, something inside you shifted. The small flame you'd spent years trying to smother erupted into a wildfire. The humiliation was still there, burning like acid. But beneath it, another feeling rose. Something cold, sharp, and crystal clear. You weren't broken. You had been incinerated, and from the ashes, someone else was rising. You smiled. It wasn't the polite practice smile. It was a real one. But it held no warmth. It held pure, unadulterated rage. And you saw it the way your smile made the laughter around you die out like a flame suddenly starved of oxygen. The room fell silent. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting. You were about to speak, and you knew the words to come would not be an apology. They would be a scalpel. And you were going to cut this tumor out of your life right here, right now. The rage didn't boil over into screams. Instead, it crystallized, becoming cold, hard, and sharp as a diamond. In that heavy silence, an eerie calm settled over you. It was the absolute focus you got when you stood before a blank bolt of fabric, visualizing every cut, every stitch that would create a finished piece. Tonight, the fabric was Grant's life, and you were ready to take the shears to it. You know what, Grant? Your voice rang out perfectly steady. It was calm and precise, the same voice you used to instruct your team in the studio. You're right. I don't meet your standards. A smug grin spread across his face, mistaking your agreement for surrender. A few of his friends snickered. They thought they were witnessing your final humiliation. Your standards, you continued, your eyes locked on his unwavering, require a wife who doesn't know about the Hearts for Kids Foundation. The words dropped into the silent room like shards of glass. Grant's smile froze. You saw him dart a quick glance toward the hospital's CFO, Mr. Scott, then back to you, panic beginning to replace his arrogance. What the hell are you talking about? Grant's voice had lost its usual confidence. You slowly reached into your sparkling clutch, one of your own designs. It suddenly felt like an armory. You pulled out your phone. Your standards require someone who wouldn't notice massive consulting fees being funneled to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A company coincidentally named Precision Medical Solutions, but registered under the name of the assistant CFO. Mr. Scott went pale. His wife, standing beside him, turned to her husband with a look of horror. The mood in the room had shifted from vicious mockery to high-stakes tension. Your standards. You went on swiping casually on your phone screen, letting each movement heighten the drama. Require someone who wouldn't hire a forensic accountant after noticing that $200,000 from the charity fund was used to purchase a limited edition Patek Philippe watch. Here's the invoice, Grant. It matches the date you told me you used your bonus to donate to the fund. You turned the screen toward the crowd, watching them lean in like moths to a flame. And here, ladies and gentlemen, is the recording of a conversation between my husband and Mr. Scott from last Tuesday discussing how to legitimize this medical equipment investment before the end of quarter audit. You pressed play. Grant's voice filled the room from the phone's speaker, small but unmistakable. We need to bury this. Run it through the subsidiary. Make it look like a vendor error. Someone dropped a glass. The sound of it shattering on the marble floor was the perfect punctuation to Grant's recorded confession. The hospital director, Mr. Arthur, a man Grant was always trying to impress, took a step back, his face crimson with rage. The Hearts for Kids Foundation. My own mother started that fund. And that's not all. You said your voice cutting through the burgeoning chaos. Your standards also require someone who doesn't know about Megan. Who's Megan? A sharp voice demanded. But it wasn't directed at you. Dr. Kyle's wife Grant's best friend had turned on her husband, who suddenly looked like he'd seen a ghost. The 24-year-old pharmaceutical intern you supplied watching the dominoes begin to fall. The one Grant has been funding in a luxury downtown apartment with money from the charity. Here's the lease agreement. And here are the texts he sent her 3 hours ago. Can't wait to be done with this boring party and see you. Stella is so pathetic, it's embarrassing. You read every word in a flat, emotionless tone, like you were reading a medical report. Each word was a precise incision, laying his hypocrisy bare. Chaos erupted. Mr. Arthur was yelling about his mother's foundation. Kyle's wife was slapping him. Mr. Scott was trying to pull his own wife out of the room. And in the middle of it all, Grant stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Oh, and Grant, you said your voice rising just enough to be heard over the noise. Your standards definitely require someone who never speaks to your mother. He looked at you, his eyes wide. Catherine called me last week. A retired CPA, she found some irregularities in the accounts you manage for her. We had a very interesting chat about where your father's retirement savings have really been going. That was the final blow. His legs seemed to give out. He sank onto a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. The man who 5 minutes ago stood in the center of the room, comparing you to a corpse, was now reduced to something small and pathetic. You turned on your heel. The click of your heels on the marble floor was the only orderly sound in the chaos. The crowd parted for you like the sea. You walked not fast, not slow, each step steady and deliberate. When you reached the door, you glanced back one last time. The scene was perfect in its destruction. Respected doctors, elegant wives, now screaming and accusing one another. And at the center of it all, your husband, no, your soon-to-be ex-husband, sat finally understanding what it felt like to be stripped bare and humiliated in front of everyone. You walked out of the ballroom and didn't look back. You weren't running away. You were walking calmly and purposefully into a future you would design yourself. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a cold emptiness as you drove home. The satisfaction of revenge was like a fever, hot and intense. But then it broke, and what remained was a bone-deep weariness. You didn't cry. Tears seemed like an unnecessary luxury. Instead, you felt a painful clarity. The house you shared now felt like an empty stage where the play of your marriage had just ended. You didn't sleep that night. You went into your design studio, a place Grant rarely entered. The space was filled with the smell of fabric graphite and stale coffee. This was your true kingdom. You ran your hands over bolts of silk swatches of tweed materials, waiting to be transformed into something beautiful. For years, you had tried to weave Grant into your life, to patch up the relationship. But the material was flawed. The thread was rotten. The next few days were a blur of lawyers' calls from the FBI and texts from people you once thought were friends. But one meeting changed everything. Heather, the CFO's wife, sought you out. She wasn't the perfectly coiffed woman with the smug smile from the party. She wore simple jeans and no makeup, her eyes puffy. "Our accounts are frozen," she said, her voice broken. "Scott was arrested this morning. I I don't know what to do." You could have gloated. You could have said, "That's what you get for laughing at someone else's pain." But looking at Heather's raw desperation, you didn't see an enemy. You saw another woman who had been betrayed, trapped in a web of lies. You invited her in, made her a cup of tea, and for the first time, you had a real conversation. You listened to her story of giving up her own law career to support her husband, of ignoring the signs because she was too afraid to face the truth. "I was so jealous of you," Heather confessed. "You had your own career, something that was yours. I laughed at you because I felt so empty." In that moment, understanding bloomed. Your anger at Grant's world began to dissolve, replaced by a compassion for the women caught within it. You realized that in this fight, you weren't alone. This spurred you to do something you never expected. You found Megan, the pharmaceutical intern. You found her living in a small, decidedly less luxurious apartment. She was terrified when she saw you, assuming you were there to unleash your fury. "I'm not here to hurt you," you said gently. "I'm here to tell you that you were a victim too, and you have a right to justice." You shared the information. You had explained how Grant had manipulated her with money and false promises. You gave her the card of a good lawyer who specialized in workplace harassment and abuse of power. Tears streamed down Megan's face. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because no one deserves to be treated like an object," you replied. "And because we're stronger when we stand together." That act freed something inside you. Empathy wasn't weakness. It was a kind of power. It allowed you to see beyond your own pain. You started thinking about the Hearts for Kids Foundation. The money had been embezzled, but the children who needed surgery were still there. You did something Grant would never have understood. You used your story. You contacted a major magazine not to tell a sordid tale of divorce, but to talk about the importance of this charity and how it had been exploited. You launched a new fundraising campaign with a promise of absolute transparency. And you designed a special collection inspired by the Japanese art of kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, believing the cracks make an object more beautiful and unique. You called it the Rebirth collection. The public response was overwhelming. Your story of betrayal and resilience struck a chord. Donations poured in. Other women who had suffered in silence began to speak out. Your sister, who had always worried about you from afar, flew in to stay with you. "You found yourself again, Stella," she said, holding you tight. The love of your family, the unexpected friendship with Heather, and the gratitude from the people you were now helping became your new materials. From the shattered pieces of your old life, you weren't just stitching yourself back together. You were weaving an entirely new tapestry, one far richer, stronger, and more beautiful precisely because of its golden threads of empathy and compassion. A year passed in what felt like a blink, but it was long enough for everything to change. Today was a crisp October day, and you were standing backstage at New York Fashion Week. The air was electric with excitement, the smell of hairspray, and palpable tension. But you felt a strange sense of peace. Your Rebirth collection was one of the most anticipated shows. The story behind it had captured the media's attention. But tonight, the designs would speak for themselves. You looked at the models lining up, wearing your creations. Silk dresses with hand-embroidered golden threads, mimicking cracks. Strong-shouldered coats made from high-end, recycled fabrics. A color palette that moved from ash gray to a brilliant sunrise gold. It was your story told in textiles. As the house lights dimmed and the music swelled, you stood in the wings and watched your work come to life. Each piece that walked the runway was a chapter, the darkness, the shattering, the process of mending, and finally, the glorious rebirth. The audience was captivated. You could feel it. When the final model made her pass, and it was your turn to take a bow, the applause was thunderous. You stepped into the light, no longer a diminished wife, but an artist at the height of her power. You saw your sister in the front row crying with happiness. You saw Heather, your unlikely ally, cheering wildly. And you knew that somewhere in that crowd were other women whose own stories had been validated by yours. After the show at the celebration party, you didn't drink champagne. You chose a glass of water. You didn't need alcohol to feel effervescent. Your joy was clear and real. News of Grant still reached you occasionally. He had been sentenced to 7 years in prison. The trial had exposed even more layers of deceit. You heard these updates not with glee or sadness, but with a detached neutrality. Grant was like a character in an old book you'd finished long ago. He was a part of your past, a healed scar, a golden seam in the pottery of your life. Your life now wasn't filled with lavish parties or social theatrics. It was filled with simple, meaningful things. Sunday mornings spent with your family, video calls with Megan, who was now the mother of a beautiful baby girl and was writing a book of her own. Board meetings for the Hearts for Kids Foundation, which you had revived and which was now helping more children than ever. One afternoon, while walking in the park, you saw a couple dancing by a fountain, just them and the music from a small speaker. The man whispered something, and the woman laughed a radiant, unforced smile. You smiled with them. You felt no envy, no bitterness. You just felt happy for them. You realized that happiness wasn't a perfect dress or a perfect-looking marriage. Happiness was peace. It was being comfortable in your own skin. It was knowing you didn't need anyone's approval to be whole. It was being surrounded by people who loved you for who you were, with all your cracks and golden seams. You sat down on a bench, looking up at the clear blue sky. A gentle breeze blew past, carrying the laughter of children playing nearby. You took out your sketchbook as a new idea sparked in your mind. You began to draw the lines confident and free. You were designing more than just clothes. You were designing your life, and that you realized was the most beautiful masterpiece of all. If you found this story helpful, please like and subscribe to Porchlight Diaries, Family Stories, so I can keep sharing. Comment where you're watching from and which part touched your heart. Maybe it'll send a little hope to someone who needs it today. Thank you for listening with such kindness.